The morning sun cast long golden rays through the windows of Millbrook High School as Marcus Thompson finished setting up chairs in the gymnasium for the monthly town hall meeting, his weathered hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 2 decades in the military before returning to his hometown to teach history. The 45-year-old veteran paused to wipe sweat from his brow, glancing at his watch and noting that Dr. Jessica Rivera would probably arrive soon with her usual stack of community health reports and that infectious smile that had been brightening the town's medical clinic for the past 3 years since she'd moved here from the bustling chaos of Chicago. Across town, 16-year-old Tommy Williams was already at his computer, fingers flying across the keyboard as he monitored the ham radio frequencies he'd been obsessing over lately, picking up strange chatter from military channels that seemed increasingly urgent and fragmented, though he couldn't quite piece together what was happening in the larger cities beyond their peaceful valley. Meanwhile, Becca Johnson was preparing her 3rd-grade classroom for another day of teaching, arranging colorful books and checking her lesson plans while humming softly to herself, completely unaware that this would be the last normal Tuesday morning any of them would ever experience. Down at Murphy's auto shop, David Park was already elbow-deep in the engine of Mrs. Henderson's old Buick, grease staining his hands as he worked with quiet concentration, occasionally glancing up at the radio that crackled with news reports about disturbances in major metropolitan areas, though the details remained frustratingly vague. At Santos Market on Main Street, Maria Santos was stocking shelves and chatting with early morning customers about the upcoming Harvest Festival, her warm laugh echoing through the small store as she discussed which local farms would be participating, her natural ability to connect with everyone in town making her the unofficial information hub of Millbrook. The town itself seemed to exist in a bubble of tranquility, with its tree-lined streets, white picket fences, and the kind of small-town atmosphere where everyone knew their neighbors, and the biggest excitement was usually the Friday night football games at the high school where Marcus coached the defensive line in his spare time. Children walked safely to school, delivery trucks made their rounds, and the morning joggers followed their predictable routes past the old church, the fire station, and the small police department where Officer Kate Mitchell was reviewing reports from what had been another perfectly quiet night. None of them could have imagined that hundreds of miles away, major cities were already falling into chaos as something unthinkable spread through the population like wildfire, turning ordinary people into something that defied explanation and challenged everything they thought they knew about the natural order of life and death. The radio reports that Tommy had been monitoring with growing concern spoke of civil unrest and mandatory evacuations, but the sanitized language of official communications couldn't convey the true horror that was methodically making its way toward their small community like an unstoppable tide of darkness. As Marcus finished his preparations and headed toward the school's main office to check in with Principal Anderson about the day's schedule, he felt an odd uneasiness that he couldn't quite shake, the same instinctive tension he'd learned to trust during his military deployments, though he tried to dismiss it as unnecessary worry about problems that surely couldn't touch their isolated corner of America. Jessica arrived at the clinic and began reviewing patient files for the day, noting with mild concern that several people had called in sick with what seemed like flu symptoms, though it was still early in the season for such widespread illness. The morning proceeded with its usual rhythm of small-town life, with school buses arriving, shops opening, and people going about their daily routines, completely unaware that their world was about to change forever and that within hours they would be forced to discover reserves of courage and determination they never knew they possessed as ordinary citizens faced with an extraordinary and terrifying new reality that would test every assumption they held about survival, community, and what it truly means to be human when confronted with the unthinkable. Tommy Williams was the first to sense that something had gone terribly wrong when the ham radio frequencies he'd been monitoring suddenly erupted with panicked voices cutting through static, military personnel shouting coordinates and medical codes that made no sense until he heard the word containment breach, repeated over and over like a desperate mantra, prompting him to frantically adjust the antenna and increase the volume just as Dr. Jessica Rivera was examining her 3rd patient of the morning who presented with the same disturbing symptoms. Fever, aggressive behavior, and an unsettling vacant stare that seemed to look right through her. Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson was midway through his first period American history class when Principal Anderson's voice crackled over the intercom with an announcement that seemed routine at first, asking all teachers to keep students in their classrooms until further notice due to developing circumstances, though the barely controlled tension in the principal's voice suggested this was anything but a standard procedure. Officer Kate Mitchell had just finished her morning patrol when her radio exploded with reports from the state police about multiple incidents of extreme violence along the interstate highways leading toward their region, descriptions so bizarre and disturbing that she initially assumed they were dealing with some kind of coordinated terrorist attack or mass poisoning event. At Santos Market, Maria noticed that several customers who had seemed perfectly normal earlier in the week were now behaving strangely, moving with jerky, unnatural movements and making disturbing guttural sounds instead of their usual friendly greetings, causing her to unconsciously step back behind the counter while maintaining her polite smile even as alarm bells rang in her mind. David Park looked up from his work when he heard screaming from the direction of Main Street, a sound so raw and terrified that it sent chills down his spine and made him reach instinctively for the tire iron on his workbench, though he couldn't yet comprehend what he might need to defend himself against. The first undeniable confirmation that their world had fundamentally changed came when Rebecca Johnson watched in horror through her classroom window as Mrs. Henderson, the sweet elderly woman whose car David had been fixing that very morning, stumbled down the sidewalk with blood covering her floral dress and her movements grotesquely wrong, like a marionette being controlled by someone who had never learned how to make a puppet walk naturally. Tommy burst into the school's main office with his portable radio, breathlessly trying to explain to Principal Anderson about the emergency broadcasts he'd been intercepting, military communications about infected populations, and reanimated casualties, words that sounded like science fiction until they heard the air raid siren from the fire station begin its ominous wail across the town. Dr. Rivera found herself barricading her clinic door when two of her earlier patients returned with a group of others who moved with that same disturbing gait, their eyes empty of recognition or humanity as they pressed against the windows with blood-stained hands, forcing her to confront the impossible reality that these were no longer the people she had tried to help just hours before. Marcus quickly moved his students away from the windows when he spotted more figures shambling across the school parking lot, their movements wrong in ways that defied explanation, while his military training kicked in and he began mentally cataloging potential exit routes and defensible positions within the building. The radio reports that Tommy continued to monitor painted an increasingly grim picture of major cities falling to what officials were now calling an unknown pathogen that seemed to reanimate the recently deceased, though the clinical language couldn't capture the horror of watching neighbors and friends transformed into something that retained their physical form but had lost everything that made them human. Officer Mitchell tried to reach the state police for backup but found only static and fragmented transmissions, leaving her to realize with growing dread that whatever was happening had spread far beyond Millbrook and that they might be completely cut off from outside help. Maria Santos made the decision to close her store and gather emergency supplies when she witnessed three of these strange figures attacking a delivery driver just outside her window, the violence swift and brutal and unlike anything she had ever imagined possible in their peaceful community. As afternoon approached and the number of these shambling figures increased throughout the town, the survivors who remained unaffected began to understand with crystal clarity that their morning had been the end of one world and the beginning of another, where the rules of civilization no longer applied and where their very survival would depend on their ability to adapt quickly to a reality that challenged everything they thought they knew about life, death, and what it meant to be human in a world where the recently dead had begun to walk again with an insatiable hunger for the living. The convergence began when Marcus Thompson made the strategic decision to move his students from the exposed classrooms to the school's reinforced gymnasium, using his military experience to create a secure perimeter while Tommy Williams continued monitoring radio transmissions that painted an increasingly apocalyptic picture of complete societal breakdown across multiple states, with fragmentary reports suggesting that military quarantine zones had been overrun within hours of their establishment. Dr. Jessica Rivera arrived at the school carrying her medical bag and a backpack full of antibiotics and emergency supplies, having abandoned her clinic when the infected had finally broken through her hastily constructed barricades, and she immediately began treating several students who had suffered minor injuries during their panicked retreat from the outer buildings. Officer Kate Mitchell pulled her patrol car up to the school's main entrance just as David Park came running from the direction of downtown, his clothes torn and grease-stained hands now covered with something darker, both of them bringing terrifying reports of the town's rapid transformation as more and more residents succumbed to whatever plague had turned their neighbors into mindless predators. Maria Santos was the last to reach their impromptu sanctuary, clutching a bag of canned goods from her store and moving with the careful stealth she'd learned during her harrowing journey through streets now filled with shambling figures who had once been her customers and friends, her usually warm demeanor replaced by the grim determination of someone who had witnessed unspeakable horrors. As the group gathered in the gymnasium and shared their individual experiences of the morning's chaos, Tommy's radio crackled with a weak transmission from what claimed to be a military survivor broadcasting from an overrun base approximately 50 miles north, the soldier's voice breaking as he described how their Operation Lazarus protocol had failed catastrophically when the infection spread faster than their containment models had predicted. The revelation that this disaster was not natural but rather the result of some kind of government experiment gone wrong sent shockwaves through the assembled survivors, particularly Marcus, whose military background made him acutely aware of the implications of such a massive institutional failure and the likelihood that no cavalry would be coming to rescue them. Rebecca Johnson worked quietly to comfort the children while listening to the adults discuss their increasingly limited options, her teacher's instincts helping her maintain calm among the youngest survivors even as she processed the horrifying reality that many of these children had already lost their families to the infection that continued to spread through their community like an unstoppable wildfire. Officer Mitchell's police radio had fallen silent hours ago, but her patrol car's emergency band occasionally picked up automated emergency broadcasts warning civilians to avoid major highways and population centers. Instructions that felt both urgent and utterly useless given their current situation trapped in what had once been their safe haven. Dr. Rivera examined each survivor for signs of infection while explaining what little she understood about the pathogen's apparent transmission method, noting that bites seemed to be the primary vector but acknowledging that their knowledge was based entirely on observation rather than any official medical guidance that might have existed before communication networks collapsed. David Park used his mechanical skills to reinforce the gymnasium's doors and windows while Marcus organized the students into small groups responsible for different aspects of their survival, from inventory management to lookout duties, both men recognizing that their diverse skill sets might be the key to lasting longer than the isolated individuals who had already fallen to the infected hordes roaming the streets. The weight of leadership fell naturally to Marcus, whose military experience and calm demeanor made him the obvious choice to coordinate their defense strategies, though he made it clear that their survival would depend on everyone contributing their unique abilities to their collective effort rather than relying on any single person to make all the critical decisions. As evening approached and the sounds of breaking glass and inhuman moaning echoed from the town beyond their barricaded sanctuary, the group began to understand that they were no longer teachers, students, shop owners, and civil servants, but rather the remnants of a civilization that had collapsed in a single day, bound together by circumstances that had transformed them into something they never expected to become, warriors in a battle for the very continuation of human consciousness against an enemy that had once been human itself. Tommy's continued monitoring of radio frequencies revealed scattered reports of other survivor groups forming in remote areas, suggesting that their fight was part of a larger struggle taking place across the country, though the isolation of their situation made it clear that whatever victories or defeats lay ahead would be determined by their own courage, ingenuity, and willingness to stand together against the endless waves of infected that continued to pour through their once peaceful community like an unstoppable tide of darkness and death. The transformation of Millbrook High School into a fortress began at dawn when Marcus Thompson organized teams to systematically strip useful materials from every classroom, with David Park leading the engineering efforts to weld metal shop equipment into reinforced barriers while Dr. Jessica Rivera established a makeshift medical station in the nurse's office, her methodical approach to inventory revealing that they had enough basic supplies to last perhaps 2 weeks if carefully rationed. Tommy Williams had spent the night documenting patterns in the radio transmissions, discovering that other survivor groups were reporting similar behavioral observations about the infected. They seemed drawn to sound and movement but appeared to have limited memory and problem-solving abilities, crucial intelligence that Marcus immediately incorporated into their defensive planning. The gymnasium's high windows provided an excellent vantage point for studying the infected who continued to wander through the town below, and Rebecca Johnson found herself reluctantly fascinated by their movements, noting how they seemed to cluster around areas where they had last detected signs of life, sometimes standing motionless for hours before suddenly lurching toward some stimulus that the survivors couldn't identify. Officer Kate Mitchell used her law enforcement training to establish patrol schedules and communication protocols, ensuring that someone was always monitoring the perimeter while others worked on strengthening their defenses, her police radio occasionally picking up fragmented transmissions from other emergency responders who were either trapped or already compromised. Maria Santos proved invaluable in organizing their food supplies and creating rationing schedules that would maximize their survival time, her experience managing inventory at the market translating perfectly to their desperate circumstances, though everyone understood that their current resources were finite and that eventually they would need to venture outside their sanctuary. The infected seemed to follow predictable patterns during different times of day, becoming more active during morning and evening hours while remaining relatively dormant during the hottest part of the afternoon, an observation that Marcus filed away as potentially crucial information for any future supply runs or evacuation attempts. David's mechanical expertise allowed him to jury-rig a solar charging system for their electronic devices using parts from the school's science lab, ensuring that Tommy could continue monitoring radio frequencies while maintaining communication capabilities with any other survivor groups they might eventually contact. Dr. Rivera's medical background proved essential when one of the students suffered a panic attack severe enough to require sedation, and her calm professional demeanor helped establish the kind of routine and structure that everyone desperately needed to maintain their psychological stability in increasingly dire circumstances. The group discovered that the infected were attracted to bright lights after dark, leading them to establish blackout protocols and develop a system of hand signals for nighttime communication, while also noting that the creatures seemed unable to climb stairs effectively, giving them a significant tactical advantage as long as they remained on the building's second floor. Rebecca's natural ability to work with children became crucial as she organized educational activities and games that kept the younger survivors occupied and prevented the kind of panic or despair that could compromise their security, her classroom management skills adapting seamlessly to their survival situation. Tommy's technical knowledge extended beyond radio operation to include basic computer programming, and he began working on a digital map of the surrounding area that incorporated their observations about infected movement patterns, safe zones, and potential resource locations, creating a valuable tool for future planning. The most disturbing discovery came when they observed that recently infected individuals retained some muscle memory from their previous lives, with former residents attempting to enter buildings they had once frequented or lingering around areas that had been significant to them before their transformation, a haunting reminder of the humanity that had been lost. Officer Mitchell's patrol routes revealed that their school fortress was increasingly surrounded by growing numbers of infected, suggesting that their activities had been noticed and that they were drawing attention from across the region, a development that added urgency to their long-term planning discussions. Maria's practical approach to problem-solving led to innovations in waste management and water conservation that significantly extended their sustainability timeline, while her emotional intelligence helped mediate conflicts between group members as stress and fear began to take their toll on everyone's patience and judgment. As their first week of survival drew to a close, the assembled group had evolved from a collection of frightened individuals into a functioning community with clearly defined roles and responsibilities, their diverse skills and backgrounds creating a synergy that none of them could have achieved alone, though everyone understood that their current safety was temporary and that eventually they would be forced to make increasingly dangerous decisions about their future survival in a world where the fundamental rules of civilization had been permanently and catastrophically altered by forces beyond their control or understanding. The cracks in their carefully constructed unity began to show during their second week of confinement when Maria Santos quietly informed Marcus Thompson that their food supplies would last only 4 more days at current rationing levels. A revelation that sparked the first serious argument among the survivors as David Park advocated for immediate supply runs while Dr. Jessica Rivera insisted that venturing outside would be suicide given the increasing concentration of infected surrounding their building. The tension escalated when Tommy Williams intercepted a radio transmission from a group claiming to have established a safe zone approximately 30 miles southeast, complete with military protection and abundant supplies, though Officer Kate Mitchell argued that the transmission could easily be a trap designed to lure desperate survivors into ambushes by hostile human groups who had chosen predation over cooperation. Rebecca Johnson found herself caught between her desire to protect the children in their care and the growing realization that staying put might condemn them all to a slow death by starvation. Her usually gentle demeanor strained by sleepless nights spent comforting terrified students while wrestling with impossible moral calculations about acceptable risk versus certain doom. The breaking point came when 16-year-old student Sarah Martinez collapsed from hunger-induced weakness, forcing Dr. Rivera to use precious medical supplies while highlighting the cruel mathematics of their situation. They could either risk lives immediately through dangerous supply runs or guarantee deaths through gradual starvation and medical emergencies they could no longer treat effectively. Marcus struggled with command decisions that would have been unthinkable in his military career, where clear chains of command and reliable intelligence had made leadership challenging but manageable, whereas their current situation required him to make life-or-death choices based on incomplete information and with the full knowledge that any mistake would result in the deaths of people who had come to trust his judgment completely. David's mechanical assessment of their situation proved particularly sobering when he calculated that their improvised barricades would fail within days under sustained pressure from the growing horde outside, noting that the infected seemed to be learning to work together in rudimentary ways, pushing against weak points in their defenses with coordination that suggested the pathogen might be evolving or that some vestige of human intelligence remained in the transformed creatures. The psychological pressure intensified when Tommy reported intercepting military communications indicating that government forces were implementing a scorched earth policy in heavily infected areas, meaning that any hopes of official rescue were effectively eliminated and that they might soon face threats from above as well as from the shambling masses below their fortress walls. Officer Mitchell's law enforcement experience made her acutely aware of how quickly civilized people could descend into violence when faced with extreme stress and limited resources, and she began noticing signs of potential fractures within their group as individual survival instincts started to override their collective commitment to mutual protection and shared decision-making. Maria's practical nature led her to begin secretly calculating which members of their group consumed the most resources relative to their contributions, a cold analysis that horrified her even as she recognized its potential necessity, while her growing certainty that some of them would not survive forced her to confront moral questions she had never imagined facing in her peaceful life as a small-town merchant. The situation reached a crisis when Dr. Rivera discovered that someone had been stealing medical supplies from her carefully managed inventory, creating not only a practical shortage but also a breakdown of the trust that had been essential to their survival, leading to accusations and defensive denials that threatened to tear apart the cooperative spirit that had kept them alive through their darkest moments. Rebecca's teaching instincts told her that the children were beginning to sense the adults' growing desperation and fear, making it increasingly difficult to maintain the pretense of safety and normalcy that had been crucial for preventing panic among their most vulnerable members, while her own reserves of patience and optimism were being steadily eroded by the constant pressure of caring for traumatized young people in impossible circumstances. As arguments about their next course of action grew more heated and personal, with long-suppressed personality conflicts surfacing under extreme stress, Marcus realized that their group was approaching a psychological breaking point that could be more dangerous than any external threat they had faced, forcing him to acknowledge that leadership in their new reality required not just tactical knowledge but also the wisdom to hold together a community of desperate people who were being pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. The final catalyst came when the infected outside began displaying new behaviors that suggested they were actively problem-solving rather than simply following basic instincts, stacking debris against their buildings' walls and coordinating their movements in ways that made their fortress feel less like a sanctuary and more like a temporary refuge that would soon become a tomb unless they could find the courage to abandon their hard-won safety and venture into the unknown darkness beyond their walls. The decision to abandon their fortress came at 3:47 a.m. when Tommy Williams detected an emergency broadcast from a National Guard unit requesting immediate assistance from any surviving medical personnel at coordinates that Dr. Jessica Rivera quickly identified as the abandoned Walmart distribution center 12 miles north of town, a location that Marcus Thompson recognized as both their best hope for massive supply acquisition and quite possibly a deadly trap that could end their survival story permanently. The plan that emerged from desperate hours of whispered debate called for a split operation. Rebecca Johnson would remain at the school with half the children and Maria Santos to maintain their fallback position, while Marcus led David Park, Officer Kate Mitchell, Dr. Rivera, and Tommy on what everyone understood might be a suicide mission into territory now completely controlled by roaming hordes of infected who had grown increasingly aggressive and coordinated in their attacks. David had spent the previous day converting the school's maintenance truck into an armored vehicle using metal shop materials and welding equipment, creating gun ports and reinforced panels while ensuring the engine could still function under the additional weight, though everyone knew that mechanical failure during their mission would mean certain death for the entire team. The pre-dawn departure required them to navigate through streets that had once been familiar but now resembled a nightmare landscape of abandoned vehicles, broken storefronts, and shambling figures who turned toward any sound with the relentless hunger that had replaced every trace of their former humanity, forcing the team to develop hand signals and movement techniques that balanced speed with stealth. Officer Mitchell's tactical training proved invaluable as she guided them through residential areas where infected clustered around homes that still contained the decaying remains of families who had barricaded themselves inside only to discover that their sanctuary had become their tomb, the sight of children's toys scattered among bloodstains serving as haunting reminders of how quickly their world had collapsed. Tommy's radio equipment picked up fragmentary signals that suggested the National Guard transmission might indeed be legitimate, though the increasing static and desperate tone of military communications indicated that even organized forces were struggling against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger and more numerous with each passing hour, adapting to human tactics with disturbing intelligence. The journey became a horrifying education in how thoroughly their familiar landscape had been transformed, with Dr. Rivera documenting behavioral patterns she observed in the infected masses, noting how they seemed to retain muscle memory for complex tasks like opening doors and climbing stairs, abilities that made them far more dangerous than the mindless shambling corpses they had initially appeared to be. David's mechanical expertise became crucial when their improvised armored vehicle suffered a flat tire in the middle of what had once been downtown Millbrook, forcing him to perform emergency repairs while Marcus and Officer Mitchell created a defensive perimeter against infected who emerged from every doorway and alley, drawn by the noise of their engine and the scent of living human flesh. The distribution center appeared on the horizon like a massive concrete fortress, its loading docks still sealed and emergency lighting still functioning, suggesting that whoever had sent the distress signal might actually have established a legitimate safe zone, though the complete absence of visible human activity made everyone acutely aware that they might be walking into an elaborate trap set by desperate survivors who had chosen predation over cooperation. Tommy's radio crackled with a clear transmission as they approached the facility, a woman's voice identifying herself as Lieutenant Angela Morrison requesting medical assistance for wounded soldiers who had been fighting a running battle against infected for over a week, her professional military bearing giving credibility to their mission even as everyone remained prepared for the possibility that this was an elaborate deception. The distribution center's parking lot was littered with military vehicles and infected corpses, evidence of fierce fighting that had left the surviving soldiers barricaded inside the main building with limited ammunition and several seriously wounded personnel who would die without immediate medical intervention, a situation that demanded both courage and quick thinking from their small rescue team. Dr. Rivera's medical bag suddenly felt inadequate for the trauma surgery that might be required, while Marcus recognized that their presence at the distribution center had been detected by infected throughout the region, meaning that their escape window was rapidly closing as shambling figures began converging on their location from all directions, transforming their rescue mission into a desperate race against time. As they prepared to enter the darkened building where unknown numbers of survivors and infected might be waiting, each member of their team understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there might be no return, committing themselves to actions that would either mark the beginning of a larger resistance movement or represent the final chapter in their brief but determined struggle against the endless waves of darkness that had consumed their world. The interior of the distribution center revealed a scene that exceeded their worst expectations and best hopes simultaneously, as Lieutenant Angela Morrison emerged from behind a makeshift barricade of shipping containers with 3 wounded soldiers and a small group of civilian survivors. Her relief at seeing Dr. Jessica Rivera's medical bag evident even as Marcus Thompson quickly assessed the tactical situation and realized they were trapped in a facility surrounded by hundreds of infected, who had been drawn by the sounds of their arrival. The next 6 hours became a crucible that tested every skill and ounce of courage the combined groups possessed, with David Park using his mechanical expertise to restore power to the building's loading dock systems while Tommy Williams coordinated radio communications between their school survivors and newly discovered resistance cells across 3 neighboring counties, revealing that their small fight was part of a much larger network of human survivors who had refused to surrender to the darkness. Dr. Rivera worked frantically to stabilize the wounded soldiers using supplies from the distribution center's medical inventory, her hands steady despite the constant background noise of infected clawing at reinforced doors and windows, while Officer Kate Mitchell and Lieutenant Morrison developed a coordinated defense strategy that utilized both military training and local knowledge to maximize their defensive capabilities against overwhelming odds. The breakthrough came when Tommy's radio intercepts revealed that the infected were being drawn away from outlying areas by a massive government evacuation operation taking place 50 miles east, creating a temporary window of opportunity that Marcus recognized as their chance to establish a permanent base of operations using the distribution center's vast resources and defensible position. Rebecca Johnson's voice crackled through Tommy's radio with reports that their school fortress was being evacuated successfully, with Maria Santos leading the children through carefully planned routes toward predetermined rally points, her natural leadership skills proving invaluable as she coordinated the movement of their most vulnerable survivors through hostile territory toward the promise of a more secure future. The turning point arrived when David discovered that the distribution center's backup generators could power a radio transmitter capable of reaching military frequencies, allowing Lieutenant Morrison to coordinate with other National Guard units and revealing that organized resistance was growing stronger as survivors learned to work together and adapt to their new reality rather than simply hiding and hoping for rescue that would never come. Dr. Rivera's medical expertise became crucial not just for treating wounds but for analyzing blood samples from infected specimens, leading to the discovery that the pathogen showed signs of instability that might eventually cause it to burn itself out, providing the first glimmer of scientific hope that the infection might not be permanent and that humanity might eventually reclaim their world from the shambling hordes that had overrun civilization. The final confrontation came at dawn when a massive wave of infected, drawn by their radio transmissions and generator noise, launched a coordinated assault on the distribution center that required every person to fight for their survival, with children barely in their teens standing alongside hardened soldiers and ordinary citizens who had discovered reserves of courage they never knew existed within themselves. Marcus found himself leading a mixed force of teachers, shop owners, police officers, and soldiers in a battle that represented everything their resistance movement had become. Ordinary people transformed by extraordinary circumstances into something stronger and more determined than the sum of their individual parts, fighting not just for survival but for the very idea that human civilization could endure against impossible odds. The victory, when it came, was hard-won and costly, but it marked the beginning of something larger than mere survival as the combined groups began planning the establishment of a permanent settlement that could serve as a beacon of hope for other survivors and a foundation for rebuilding the world that had been lost to the infection that had swept across the land like a terrible tide. Tommy's radio network expanded to include dozens of survivor groups who reported similar victories against the infected, creating a communication web that allowed isolated communities to share resources, coordinate defense strategies, and maintain the human connections that would be essential for any long-term recovery from the catastrophe that had tested their species' will to survive and ultimately proven that courage, cooperation, and determination could triumph over even the darkest forces that threatened to extinguish the light of human consciousness. As the sun rose over their hard-won fortress, casting golden light through windows that had been cleansed of the handprints of the dead, Marcus Thompson looked out at his diverse group of survivors and realized that they had become something that none of them had ever expected to be: the foundation of a new world built on the unshakable knowledge that when ordinary people stand together against extraordinary darkness, they become capable of miracles that can transform defeat into victory and despair into hope for generations yet to come.